So Nicholas, do you want to start things off?
Sure, yeah. Thanks for joining us, Representative Robbie. And your phone audio is pretty good. It's a little bit low, so we might ask you to speak
Okay.
louder at some point. But thank you for joining us. We just had the primary election, so we know things have been very busy. Congratulations on your primary election victory. Very good to see. So I'll just provide a little introduction for you and then start off with some questions. And as we're going along, I have some questions that members sent in, and then if people on the call have other questions, please enter them in the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can. State Rep Yousef Rabhi is in his second term, representing the 53rd House District, which includes parts of Ann Arbor, Pittsfield, and Scioto townships. And he was born in Ypsilanti, raised in Ann Arbor, attended the University of Michigan, earned a degree in environmental science with a specialization in urban planning and ecosystem management. While in college, he worked for social change as an activist in peace, labor, and environmental movements. And his first elected position was on the County Board of Commissioners. And I think in a recent Facebook post, Representative Robbie said that he won that race by a single vote with two votes after the recount. So that was a nail biter. In his first term in the Michigan House, he coordinated a bipartisan renewable energy legislation package. And we're very interested in the bipartisan policymaking angle because we're trying to advance bipartisan legislation on climate solutions. He also served on the Appropriations Committee, including subcommittees on higher ed, community colleges, and the Department of Environmental Quality. So thank you again, Representative Robbie, for joining us today. We'd like to start off by asking you to speak a little bit about the insights you have gleaned from working on bipartisan environmental solutions and how to effectively work across the aisle when crafting policy. So take it away.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So can you hear me a little bit better? I put earbuds in. I found some in my console.
Yeah, that is a little louder. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Perfect. Yeah, so first of all, well, thanks for inviting me to be part of this, and to everybody for tuning in and for your, advocacy and activism around, climate change, climate justice, one of the biggest issues, obviously, that's facing our world right now. So in terms of, legislation that we've been working on and the bipartisan nature of that work, I do think that it's a very interesting topic, and it's one that I think is at the cross section of, like you were saying, it's how we're going to be able to move a lot of this stuff forward with the partisan gridlock that we've seen in between Washington, even in Lansing. One party will not be able to do this alone, and I firmly believe that even if one party were able to push through a policy, the fact that things swing back and forth so quickly, it could mean that policy becomes under attack pretty quickly once the other party takes over. So, a few, I guess, overarching principles that I'll mention, and then I'm happy to go into more detail based on your questions. But, one of the things I would say is we often get caught in this tribalism of, them and us, and oftentimes what we lose is the reminder that much of politics and much of policy is actually fundamentally about relationships first and foremost. It certainly is about the detail of the policy, but if you don't have a good relationship with your colleagues or with the folks across the aisle that you're trying to work with, it basically stops the discussion right there. So really the first step in the process is building the relationship. And usually what I try to do in that process of building the relationship is actually trying to gain a better understanding of why my colleague arrived at the position that they have. Why do you believe that climate change isn't real? And attaching it not really from a judgmental, line of questioning, but really from a place of trying to truly understand without, following it up with like, well, you're absolutely wrong. You're the devil, you're the worst, just, okay, I hear you, and just listening to what that person has to say. And then from there, you build the opportunity to have further dialogue and conversations. And that's where you oftentimes then also find those areas of overlap where you may not have known that it's something that you agree with this other person on, because it may be an issue that is that you're coming at from a completely different angle, right? That your belief system you know, leads you to the same conclusion, but from a different place. And it's finding those opportunities through that dialogue and through those conversations that you can build those pieces of legislation, I think, that are really powerful. And so, you know, one of those examples was referenced, and it's the, you know, idea that we should be encouraging more people to be able to install solar and other alternative energies on their home and or commercial properties. And it's something that has gained bipartisan support through the efforts of myself and also my predecessor, Jeff Irwin, who, you know, helped to begin those conversations and build those coalitions between those of us who consider ourselves to be on the progressive, you know, left side of the spectrum, and those who are on the more libertarian, free market, right side of the spectrum, who, you know, who are in the, you know, the far right factions of the Republican caucus. And of course, they're coming at this issue from the perspective of wanting more choice for consumers because of a belief, a deep-seated belief in the power of the free market to drive down costs and to be the most effective and efficient way of delivering services to people. Now, I am not somebody who necessarily subscribes to that notion, but of course, my approach to this is the current system that we have now, where we have a government-condoned corporate monopoly, is basically the worst of both worlds, in my opinion, because, you know, it is essentially the government subsidizing corporate profits, not for the benefit of the public, but for the benefit of the DTE and consumer shareholders, which should never be what's in the interest of, well, it should never be what the government does, frankly, that if the system that we have just isn't working. And so that's part of why, you know, I approach this with the perspective of we don't have a good system right now, and the climate is in peril. We are, you know, literally burning the planet up, and anything that we can do to expand renewable energy installation, whether that be by private investment or public investment, I am willing to entertain all of those options. And so that's why I come to the table from a very different perspective. It has nothing to do with the free market. It has everything to do with the environment and the state of our planet. But despite that, we found that opportunity. Yeah.
Was that attitude, the higher level attitude that the planet was in danger and something needed to be done, was that shared by the more free market oriented folks? Is that what brought you both together?
No.
So how did you figure out what common ground you did have?
Again, it was really through the dialogue and the conversations of just, you know, sitting down with them and trying to understand better, you know, and asking questions and trying to peel back the layers of the onion and understand where they were coming from. And really, once we found that we had common ground, that we both had shared negative feelings towards our current setup in terms of the energy system, then we were able to sort of build from there to determine, you know, sort of a path forward. One of the things that I was able to, you know, flag early on was there's always been a push on the part of these free market libertarian Republicans to create more choice, quote unquote choice in the market by, right now there's choice caps. There's a 10% choice cap that the utilities have put in, which basically don't permit individuals to go on the free market and buy their energy that way. And the Republican libertarians have been pushing really hard to eliminate that cap. And so I kind of thought, well, one good way of creating more choice in the market is by increasing, you know, the production of solar energy. So here's an opportunity for us to work together to do something like that. My office then drafted the legislation. We sat down with these other, you know, Republicans. They were very excited about the idea because it lined up with their values too. They took the bills, they introduced them, and the rest is, you know, as they say, history. But that's kind of how we got to there.
So one thing that we are working on is to get U.S. Congress level legislators to endorse legislation. What is a good way to engage with legislators to get them to endorse a bill? You just mentioned some ways to communicate between offices, but that's between legislators. So if we are citizens trying to influence what a legislator does, what are some things that we could do, and what are some mistakes that you see environmental organizations make when engaging with policymakers?
Right. So there's a whole other angle of this that I didn't mention earlier, and I'm glad that you asked that question, because the other part of this package's success so far has been the support from not only the environmental community, but a broad coalition of groups that have come together and said that this is important. And again, it includes groups on the conservative side of the spectrum, like the Conservative Energy Forum, whose purpose is essentially to, increase the choice market. But it also includes the League of Conservation Voters, the Sierra Club, and a number of other organizations that are lobby groups. Now, you may think of them as, I think you should think of your organization a very similar way that we think of the League of Conservation Voters or the Sierra Club, and you have just as much ability as them in many ways to be quote unquote lobbyists, citizen lobbyists, to help build those relationships. And so what they actually did is they, League of Conservation Voters actually has a lobby firm on retainer in Lansing, and that lobby firm worked with my office and the Republicans, because those lobbyists already had relationships too with the Republicans, but so did the League. The League of Conservation Voters had also built those through their government relations people, and so did the Sierra Club to some extent, as well as, obviously these other conservative energy groups. And so they sort of they helped build the coalition outside of the Capitol as well, between conservatives and, environmentalists, to then go back into the Capitol building and sit down and have those meetings, so that, and then too, it wasn't just the environmental group sitting down with Tom Barrett, for example, and saying, hey, would you sponsor this legislation? It was followed up with, the Conservative Energy Forum folks coming in and saying, hey, this is really good legislation. I know you don't usually get along with the environmental groups, but this is really good, and we want you to support it. So that also stems from relationships. It stems from the fact that the environmental groups were willing to, sit down early on with people like Tom Barrett and others and hear them out and again, listen to them and disagree, politely with their positions, but also just build the relationship and not create a tension that was unnecessary. And so for you guys, I think, having those meetings, if you have an opportunity to, even with congressional staff, to just outline, who you are and what it is that you're doing, but then also just building the relationship and asking and trying to understand better what the legislator's position is. I think that goes a long way in showing good faith and building that relationship to ultimately be able to work on legislation together.
In that relationship building process, so we always come to legislators asking for them to do something, right? So,
right.
But it's two-sided, right? So what is the primary benefit of legislators to engaging with groups like ours?
There's a few things. One is that most legislators are willing to take a meeting with just about any group, whether they're constituents or not. But the way that you can really drive up the, the incentive of the meeting or the value of the meeting to the legislator is to bring constituents of the legislators to the meeting, to actually be the ones to speak and be the ones to build that relationship. That's by far the most powerful way to do it, particularly if that person is involved in the community and is a well-known entity. Then you're starting to build a relationship in a way that the legislator is starting to take note a little bit more. Now, of course, there's also the dynamic, which I don't know that your group is really involved in this as much, but there's the dynamic that, for example, the League of Conservation Voters has, which is that they get involved in elections, and they've done a very careful job of leaning into, whether through their endorsement process or whether through their campaign contributions, in a very judicious way, to not burn any bridges with potentially friendly Republican legislators, but also to support, those that they know are very close friends of the cause. And so they've done a good job of sort of balancing that, and sometimes, frankly, have drawn criticism for taking that more nuanced approach. But it has led to their ability to build relationships in a bit of a different way. So.
And what about in the state of Michigan anyway? Because we mostly focus on the U.S. Congress level, but we're also just in general trying to decarbonize the economy. So you've done a lot of work on renewable energy in Michigan, and what state legislation do you see as important for moving the state towards carbon neutrality, and how could a group like ours become involved in legislation like that getting passed?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I think there's a few different routes that we need to be looking at. So, I'll kind of start with my ideal of what I would like to see as a solution for individual communities, and even frankly the state as a whole. There's really three. There's four major models for energy ownership and production that are, have been used between Michigan and other states. And the least desirable for me is actually the open, the one that we have now, which is the government, supports a monopoly to run. Like I said, corporate profits are basically guaranteed to these companies. And it is a sort of graft that I think is unacceptable in government. Then there's the completely free market system where everybody gets to choose their, where they buy power from. I think that's also a really bad way of structuring it. And then there's the cooperative model, which I actually really like too, which is basically the consumers of the energy own the cooperative that provides them the energy. And we actually have a strong legal basis for that in the state of Michigan and a number of energy co-ops that are already in operation. My preferred option for energy ownership is actually municipal or state ownership of power. And the reason that I bring up the ownership structure and why that's important is because that has everything to do with our ability to move to carbon neutrality in our energy production. If it is not profitable, DTE and consumers will not move to renewable energy, period. They have said that they'll make, strides to 100%, all this stuff. So far, it has not panned out to something real. And frankly, with the same breath that they say that they're going to be 100% renewable, they spend millions of dollars to invest in a new natural gas facility, which sure has less point source carbon pollution, but is still a non-renewable fossil fuel that emits all kinds of greenhouse gases. So there's a duplicity in what they're saying, and it's because of the profit model of our investor-owned utilities. So I think that one of the most fundamental ways that we need to look at in terms of changing to carbon neutrality is to look at ownership of our energy systems and to move towards public and municipal ownership. So that's kind of pie in the sky, but important. The other piece of it that I think is more actionable right now is we have a renewable energy portfolio in the state of Michigan. It's mandated by state law. In the 2018 energy law, it was a 10% renewable energy portfolio standard. It was increased to 15% in the 2016 energy law. The utilities statewide are supposed to achieve that 15% by 2021. Obviously, 15% is laughable. It's ridiculous. It's not even close to what we need. And still, DTE and consumers, well, mostly DTE, are dragging their feet to get there. So one of the things that we need to do is create a more aggressive renewable energy portfolio standard in the state of Michigan. And that's why I've introduced a bill both sessions of my time in office to set a 100% renewable energy portfolio standard by the year 2050. Now, we can argue whether or not we want it to be more aggressive or we want it to be 2030. The reality is that instead of carbon neutrality, which the goal of carbon neutrality, which is, you have to be careful about the words that we use too, because carbon neutrality, if we were to set a 100% carbon neutrality goal for our utilities, that would include them being able to purchase renewable energy offsets or use things like nuclear energy. In the Michigan Renewable Energy Portfolio Standard, if they were to have to achieve 100% by 2050, that would mean that they would have to achieve it without the use of carbon credits, without the use of nuclear energy. They would have to be 100% renewable energy, Now, there are some renewable energies defined in the act that I would probably want to remove, but they're pretty minor and are not really that widely used. So, but really the biggest ones are things like solar and wind, geothermal, and that's what basically the utilities would have to move towards under this. So that is an actionable item. It's something that has increased in popularity. We've been able to push the envelope on it a little bit and actually increase support within at least the Democratic caucus towards, pushing it forward. So that's something that's important. That's an issue that the Republicans will probably not get behind, frankly, because it is a government mandate on the private sector, and that's something that they generally are not happy about. So just frankly, that's something that the Republicans may never get behind. We may be able to get one or two if we can make a business case for it, but certainly not those libertarians I was referencing earlier. And then the final piece that I'll mention is on, the bills that I've been working on increasing net metering, access to homeowners to be able to install their own renewable energy systems on their homes. And a lot of that has to do with taking on the rates that the utilities have pushed the Michigan Public Service Commission to set, and those are rates that we have to change. Moving away from net metering was a mistake that the MPSC made. It was enabled under the 2016 energy law. I've introduced bills to repeal that provision of the 2016 energy law and, of course, to move us back to a net metering system. So those are really kind of the three buckets that I would encourage us looking at. I think I kind of went in reverse order of what's possible, but those are the three big buckets.
So that was a wonderful overview of all the policy options and levers that are available. And one thing that Citizens Climate Lobby feels is important is carbon pricing. And I didn't hear as much about carbon pricing in there. Senator Debbie Stabenow has co-sponsored a bill for paying agricultural producers some money for putting carbon in the soil. Is there a discussion of carbon pricing at the state level? Where does carbon pricing fit into these initiatives?
I haven't heard as much conversation about it, and part of it is because I think that a lot of the emissions regulation does come from the EPA and the federal government on carbon, and the state of Michigan doesn't have an infrastructure right now, I don't believe, to be able to track and tax carbon emissions. So it would just be, if it's feasible, it would be a much, you'd have to basically create a new structure, legislative structure for it to be possible. A lot of these other things that I've talked about are basically changing, like we already have laws for municipal utilities. We already have a renewable energy portfolio. It's just about changing the number. And we already had net metering within our grasp, and then they took it away from us. So these are all things that we have the legal infrastructure already to set up, and carbon pricing just, I don't believe at this point has that infrastructure. That doesn't mean it's not possible to do. It's just the lift is a little bit harder than it would be on the federal level, where you have EPA regulators that already have a role in setting carbon emission standards.
Thank you. And we have a question from member Chris. Are you saying that reaching 100% renewable energy is better than reaching carbon neutrality, all else being equal? Could you talk about that difference?
Yes. So I think that when you're talking about the energy, renewable energy portfolio standard, I 100% believe that carbon neutrality is less desirable than fully renewable, because I don't, well, first of all, I am not of the belief that nuclear energy is a good alternative. I don't see it as a renewable energy. I see it as a liability that we're, putting on future generations in terms of waste disposal. And so I believe that we should be trying to achieve 100% renewable energy without the use of nuclear. And I don't think that using carbon offsets is as desirable either, because it essentially allows for the continued use and emission of of carbon and pollution, frankly, which often endanger and hurt communities of color more than other communities. And so, is it okay for DTE to continue operating, a coal burning facility downriver, that's, polluting the lungs of, low income, Black and Latino communities and allowing them to buy an offset for those carbon emissions? I don't think that's right. I think we should say, no, you have to stop, putting coal into the air and, oil and gas. You have to just go 100% renewable energy. And the thing is the technology is there for it. It's not like this is beyond our grasp. The technology is there. It's at a cost now where it should not be cost prohibitive for them to be able to do it. And it's the right thing to do. And so I do think that carbon neutrality is, and frankly, if you look at the Green New Deal calls for carbon neutrality by 2050, which I think, if we're looking at something more aggressive than that, yeah, we should be looking at 100% renewable for our energy generation by 2050. Frankly, we should be looking at it sooner, but that's, I think, where more folks are starting to coalesce, which is good.
You had mentioned previously about public ownership and renewable energy portfolio being needed because utility companies are not on their own going to do anything that isn't profitable. And we have a question from Craig that says, do you think if a sufficient carbon tax were enacted, that would change those companies' profitability calculations such that they would move towards renewable energy?
Maybe. I think that they would. So there's a few things. So the first is, if you structured it in such a way that the company had to basically eat the increased carbon tax via their profits, then yeah, they would certainly take note. But what would most likely happen is that DTE would say, oh, okay, you're going to tax me for carbon. Now everybody's utility rates are going to go up. And yeah, it may accelerate a little bit their transition to renewable energy, but their stopgap measure would be to make everybody's rates go up. And then they would blame environmentalists for it. And they would say, look what they made us do. Because that's what they've been doing, basically. And so I think that it may lead to that in the long term, but in the immediate term, they would just increase rates and not transition as fast as they would if there was a government mandate for them to actually make the transition. That's my opinion.
Thank you. And I also want to touch on what you were saying about things like carbon credits being a way that polluters can continue to pollute certain communities. Environmental justice has become much more prominent in the last few years. We as an organization are trying to find ways to incorporate environmental justice into our work. Do you see a divide between these traditional, quote unquote, traditional environmental groups like the League of Conservation Voters and Sierra Club and environmental justice organizations that are worried about carbon pricing or carbon credits allowing that kind of pollution to continue? And if so, what can we do to bridge that divide?
Yeah, I think that there is still some division, but honestly, I see that a lot of the traditional environmental groups are starting to really evaluate, and rethink how they're looking at a lot of these issues to make sure that the solutions that they're coming up with are being done in a way that doesn't hurt low-income communities and communities of color, and frankly, working families too. I mean, one of the big issues that we're seeing across issues is the tension between labor organizations, which advocate generally for working people, and environmental groups. And, it's sort of interesting to see that dynamic unfold, because oftentimes it pits the two against each other. And I don't know that there's a solution to that that's come forward yet, but it's certainly something that I think a lot of environmental groups are trying to consider now. But more specifically on the environmental justice piece, I think that there's been some issues of common ground that have been certainly found. And, like the Detroit incinerator, that's something that League of Conservation Voters, Sierra Club, and, grassroots environmental justice community organizations all coalesced around, agreed upon, and fought for. And those opportunities really help to build those relationships, frankly, like we were talking about, and reduce that divide. And like I said, I think that there's a growing awareness on the part of the traditional environmental groups about these environmental justice issues. They're not 100% there yet, but they're getting there. And so this is kind of a side note, and I won't go on, but there was an example recently where a piece of legislation that was billed as legislation to help conserve our fisheries in the Great Lakes actually was something that would have hurt the tribal communities across Michigan and infringed on their sovereign tribal fishing rights. And the environmental groups jumped on the bill on the side of, quote unquote, conserving the fish without really looking into the consequences and the impact on the tribal communities. And so that's something that came to light. I flagged it for them, and I think it was just a blind spot that they had. And so there continue to be issues like that, but I think that the awareness is growing.
Well, unfortunately, we're running short on time. Thank you so much for joining us, Representative Rabhi. Would you like to make any final comment here before we say goodbye?
Well, sure. I just want to say thank you again for having me on and for all the work that you're doing. Obviously, we're facing, obviously the coronavirus is a big crisis, but right with that is climate change, and the fact that you're thinking of creative solutions and that we're talking through what those might look like. This is what will change the future of our planet, and this is what makes me excited. This is what gets me up every morning. If there's legislation that you think that I should be working on, I want to work with all of you to help draft that legislation and to use my office like we have been with other groups like the League of Conservation Voters and the Sierra Club and others as an engine to write these environmental bills, environmental justice or climate change related bills that we can then, even if they don't pass under this legislature, or whether I'm not still in office when they pass, at least we can draft them so that future legislators can take those bills up, and this organization and others can build those relationships with legislators and push those pieces of legislation over the finish line. So count me in as an ally. Let me know what I can do. Stay in touch. And again, thank you for all your good work.
Thank you so much, Representative.
Rabhi. Thanks for your hard work.
Absolutely.
Congratulations again on your primary victory.
Take care.
I appreciate that. Appreciate all your support. Thank you.
Goodbye.
All right. Bye.